What is the most French car of all time? It's an odd question, but I think I've got the answer, and it's not what you're thinking. So, what defines a French car? What makes French cars what they are? Well, to start off with, they're weird. They're complicated, they're often commercially unsuccessful, and they have weird styling. They're usually not enthusiast cars, but they're loved by car enthusiasts anyway due to just how unique they are and the crazy technology they use to make their cars as comfortable as possible. It's hard not to love French cars. They're often very impressive bits of engineering. You can always tell a French car was designed by someone incredibly clever and equally creative. They have ways of coming up with things nobody else has thought of, for the most part because nobody else wanted them. Such as the Renault Twizy, which combines the safety of a motorbike with the acceleration of a pedestrian. Now that is innovation, no other car can do that. But the Renault Twizy is not the most French car of all time, because the most French car of all time needs to have something genius about it, and the Twizy is anything but genius. Perhaps the most French car of all time is the most popular car in France right now, the Renault Clio. If everyone in France is buying it, surely it must be very French. But no. You see, let's have a quick look at this car here. This is the latest Mitsubishi Colt, a Japanese car. But hang on a second, why does the bonnet have that strange shape cut into it? That is where the Renault badge goes, because the Mitsubishi Colt is actually a rebadged Renault Clio. But if you didn't know this, you'd see the Mitsubishi Colt and you'd say, that's a Japanese car. The most French car of all time needs to look unmistakably French. It needs to look so French that it still looks French if you put a Mitsubishi badge on it. Perhaps the Renault 4 is the most French car of all time. It certainly looks very weird in a French way, but it's technologically just too conventional to be the most French car of all time. Its only quirk is its asymmetric wheelbase due to the use of torsion bar suspension and the fact that for some reason they were still making it in 1994. But we're definitely getting closer. The Renault 4 came after the Renault 4 CV, which is quite similar sounding to 2CV. Of course, the Citroën 2CV. Is the Citroën 2CV the most French car of all time though? Well, it is extremely weird in many ways. It looks weird, the engine sounds weird, it's got a weird gearbox, and the suspension was really weird. It had a single spring for both the front and the rear that was shared, which meant it had independent suspension from the left to the right side, but non-independent suspension from the front to the rear. The CV in 2CV stands for cheval, the French word for horse. The true English translation of the deux chevaux name would be to call it the 2 horsepower. They called it the 2 horsepower because it has 9 horsepower. How French is that? Not only that, but it was innovative that they managed to build a car so cheap. Post-war Europe was a poor place and they needed a cheap car, although its design does date before World War II. When the Nazis invaded France, Citroën buried the 2CV prototypes to hide them and ensure they could not use the 2CV for military purposes. The prototype that they buried was even weirder. It only had one headlight and it had a hand-cranked starter. 27 years after the first car with an electric starter was produced. The 2CV was what got France moving after World War II. In fact, they were still making it up until 1990. Who in the world bought a brand new Citroën 2CV in 1990? They needed a disorder named after them. But the fact that it was sold until 1990 was because of the same reason I can't call the 2CV the most French car of all time. The reason being that it was commercially highly successful. And French cars are famous for being technologically genius cars that nobody buys. And for that, the 2CV is not the most French car of all time. So, if the 2CV isn't the most French car of all time, what is? Could it be the Citroën DS? It came from the same designer as the 2CV, and it got its own crazy quirks. It's good looking, but definitely weird. As well as in the styling department, it has some very weird features on the inside. The steering wheel has a single spoke, the indicators are on a single rocker switch, and for some reason the handbrake applies to the front wheels instead of the rears because the wheelbase is adjustable. But it's not the quirks and the weirdness that makes the Citroën DS famous. Well, that's part of it. What it's famous for is innovation. When it came out in 1955, a time when almost half of all Australian households didn't have an indoor toilet, a time when passenger jet travel was not available because all the comets were grounded, a time when people thought that selling toy atomic energy labs to children with real radioactive material was a good idea and that hiding under a desk would help you survive a nuclear war. So with that in mind, what sort of features did the Citroën DS have? Well, to start off with, it had a monocoque chassis, just like a modern car, with crumple zones and an engine that would drop under the car in a crash, something most cars didn't have until the 1970s or 80s. It had a semi-automatic gearbox, meaning you didn't have to use the clutch, but it still had fuel efficiency of a manual gearbox. It had power-assisted braking and steering, and later models got headlights that would turn as you turn the steering wheel, and it came on radial tyres right from the start. But its most important innovation was with the suspension, because it had something called hydropneumatic suspension. Instead of springs or air suspension, it used a liquid and a gas, hence the name, hydropneumatic. The springs were replaced with spheres, with a sheet of rubber in the middle. Below the sheet was hydraulic fluid, and above was nitrogen gas. Gases are compressible, liquids are not. When the car's suspension would be compressed suddenly by a bump, the fluid would be pushed up into the gas, causing the gas to compress. When this would happen, the change in pressure would force the hydraulic fluid out of the sphere and re-level the car. But since it's not compressible, this would only happen slowly, causing the spring to return in a much more gentle manner. The opposite would occur when the spring extends from a dip in the road. But when the car went around a corner, the rolling force from cornering is much more gradual than the shock force from hitting the bump. So the hydraulic fluid would be able to flow into the sphere in time before the gas is compressed. The result is that the car would have no roll in the corners basically, whilst also being extremely smooth and comfortable on the bumps. And the best part, it did all of this with no computerization or electronics. It was entirely a mechanical system. It also allowed for manual height adjustment by the driver whilst the car is in motion. And the car was so stable with this suspension that it could drive on 3 wheels. French President Charles de Gaulle was being driven in one when a group of far-right nationalists, angered by him pulling out of Algeria, attempted to assassinate him, shooting at his car and taking out multiple tyres. He survived, and the car continued to drive despite the loss of its tyres. This suspension design was made out of necessity. Roads in post-war France were in shocking condition, and they needed suspension that could deal with such roads without compromising high-speed stability. Much of the French ingenuity in their cars came from necessity. They even showed this ingenuity during World War II. Under Nazi occupation, Citroën boss Pierre-Jules Boulanger made Citroën's employees put the notch on the oil dipsticks for Citroën trucks in the wrong place, causing the engines to not have enough oil and fail spectacularly. This was just one of many tactics the French used under Nazi occupation that made the country infuriating to hold on to. As a tribute to this, they made sure to include catastrophic engine failure as a feature of all their future passenger cars to this day. It was this sort of genius that led to unconventional thought processes that made the Citroën DS the most innovative car the world has ever seen. But there is a problem with the Citroën DS. It was also a massive commercial success, just like the 2CV. But also, to find what's truly the most French car of all time, we need to think the way a Frenchman would think. The Citroën DS is too much of an obvious choice. Picking something iconic and easy to think of would be the Australian way of answering this question. A Frenchman would surely come up with a far more creative and unconventional answer rather than the car everyone thinks of when they think of French cars. And that brings me on to what's actually the most French car of all time. In 1982, Citroën released the BX. It was not a direct successor of the DS, being a mid-sized car rather than a large car, but it had many of the same technologies but modernised, such as having a more refined hydropneumatic suspension than its predecessors and having plastics on the interior. However, one thing that reviewers often noted about Citroëns throughout the brand's history is that they never had much in the way of high performance. Citroëns could corner flat, but that's where the performance ended. They lacked feel and were all front-wheel drive. After all, it was Citroën who were the first to sell a front-wheel drive car. Citroëns were comfortable cars, but they weren't known for driver engagement. They needed to change their image and show that big Citroëns could be fun and interesting cars to drive. They needed to go rallying, and that's exactly what they did, bringing a car to the World Rally Championship in the top class, complying with the most overrated set of motorsport regulations in history, Group B. In order to comply with Group B rules, they needed to create 200 homologation specials of the car. The advantage of using a homologation special is that it allows you to completely change the car from the road-going model and put features in the car that wouldn't normally sell well on the road. But the head of Citroën Sport, Guy Verrier, clearly didn't get the memo because he decided to keep as much of the regular road car as possible in the homologation special. To compare, let's look at the Peugeot 205 T16. Peugeot had recently bought Citroën, so the cars should surely have a similar design philosophy. The T16 looked vaguely like the regular 205, but shared almost nothing with a regular car. It was an innovative machine that brought the idea of making a silhouette car that looks a bit like an ordinary hatchback but has nothing to do with a road car into rallying. Before this, they either used sports coupes as the basis, or they used regular passenger cars and capitalised on their sturdiness over the sports cars. The T16 had a mid-engine layout and composite bodywork and a space frame chassis. This all meant it was extremely light and nimble. The Citroën BX 4TC, on the other hand, retained its longitudinal front engine, which meant that the engine had to be pushed forward to accommodate the all-wheel drive system behind the engine, giving it a worse weight distribution than the original Audi Quattro. Much like the Quattro, it also lacked a centre differential, giving it very poor low-speed manoeuvrability and was not capable of performing handbrake turns. The large, double-element rear wing made plenty of downforce, and its higher mounting and more sloped rear window meant the wing was quite efficient too. But the lack of front aero devices meant that the downforce was almost all at the rear, giving the car poor high-speed manoeuvrability, but with the benefit of greater stability. The car retained its standard steel chassis, giving it a weight of 1,150 kilograms, more than any other manufacturer-backed Group B car in 1986. The engine's power output was also not significantly increased. The engine produced just 380 horsepower, making it the least powerful factory-backed Group B car in 1986, giving it by far the worst power-to-weight ratio. In fact, the engine still used a cast iron block and didn't use double overhead cams. The only good thing about the BX4TC that it did feature was its hydropneumatic suspension. The ability to keep all four wheels contacting the road whilst also having very little body roll and instant adjustability is a huge benefit in rallying that would help claw back the disadvantage the car had from its heavy weight, low power output, lack of centre differential, poor weight distribution, and aerodynamic imbalance. You really have to question the sanity of Citroën's engineers when they decided to enter a car that's so clearly outmatched by the competition, showing up in the 1986 World Rally Championship with a Citroën BX 4TC be like showing up at the Battle of Normandy armed with a tablespoon. The car may have been competitive had it been entered in 1982 instead of 1986, since the long wheelbase Quattros also had many of the same issues with the drivetrain layout, but without the better suspension. But entering in 1986, when the whole field other than Audi were silhouette cars makes you really wonder what exactly they were thinking. But there's no denying the BX4TC is by far the most unique rally car to have been entered officially by a manufacturer in the top class. It was weirdly innovative with the suspension but completely outdated with the chassis and engine, and the transmission. So how did it perform? The car was entered in 2 championships, the World Rally Championship and the French Gravel Rally Championship. I'll start with the French Gravel Rally Championship. In Rallye de la Première Terre, both cars retired. In Rallye Terre de Provence, both cars retired. In Rallye Ronde de la Découverte, both cars retired. And in Rallye Terre de Charente, Oliver Tabaton finished 10th and François Chauche retired. So, not so good in the National Championship, but what about the World Rally Championship? Well, in Rally Monte Carlo, Philippe Wamberg's hydraulic system failed, leading to the suspension failing. Jean-Claude André's car didn't fail, but Jean-Claude André himself did, crashing out on stage 7, the car's tricky handling getting the better of him. The following rally of Sweden would see a BX4TC actually finish the rally and take 6th place, the car's first ever points finish. But it was clear that the car was entirely uncompetitive and outclassed in every conceivable way. Citroën decided to miss the next few rounds of the championship in order to work on the car more. They made their return in Rally Acropolis. The FIA's historic database shows that Citroën made homologation changes to the brakes, steering, and suspension. All of these are on the same hydraulic system, so it's most likely that they made changes to the hydraulic system. They also replaced all the body panels with ones made from Kevlar to save weight. The result was a faster car, but it still retained the steel chassis and the lack of a centre diff. The other issue was the hydropneumatic suspension that had shorter travel than the coil springs of their competitors, meaning that although it was perfect for small bumps, on larger bumps the suspension would bottom out, giving the Citroën actually quite a rough ride at higher speeds on harsher bumps. Unsurprisingly, none of the 3 BX4TCs they entered in the Rally of Acropolis actually finished. That would be the end of the Citroën BX4TC's appearance in the World Rally Championship. Citroën would leave the top class of the sport, not to return until 2002. More on that later in the video. The road-going BX4TC homologation cars also had reliability issues. In fact, they were deemed to be so bad that they were an embarrassment to the Citroën brand, with the company buying them back from the owners and scrapping them. That being said, there are still some surviving BX4TC homologation cars on the road today. But why do I think the BX4TC is the most French car of all time? Well, it had some really clever technology with the hydropneumatic suspension, which could prove advantageous in many situations. And if they could work out how to get some longer travel into their hydropneumatic system, it would be vastly superior to coil springs in all metrics other than weight. But despite the genius technology in it, the car featured design choices that made absolutely no sense, and its homologation special was a complete commercial failure, not to mention how bizarre both the rally car and the road car looked, with the enormous front overhang of course. The BX4TC is not the obvious choice for the most French car in the world, and if there's any common pattern in all these cars, it's that the French never picked the obvious answer. And for that, the Citroën BX4TC is the most French car of all time. But we can't leave it at that, because the BX4TC has some legacy. Citroën remained in rallying with a Visa, and then the AX, and eventually the Saxo in the lower classes, but they retained the hopes of returning to the top class of the World Championship one day. Then, in 2002, they did exactly that, producing one of the most dominant cars in the history of any motorsport ever. Fitted with active suspension and 4-wheel drive with a highly advanced active transmission system and unparalleled reliability, the Citroën Zara World Rally car was a name to be feared in rallying throughout the 2000s, winning 11 of the 16 rounds in the 2005 World Rally Championship. The car was so well engineered that it was getting podiums as late as 2009, 4 years after factory support and development ceased for the car. The Zara was replaced officially in 2007 by the equally dominant C4, which was then replaced by the DS3 for 2011, which won the 2011 and 2012 Drivers' and Manufacturers' Championship. Overall, Citroën won the Constructors' Championship from 2003 until 2005, followed by 2008 until 2012, whilst Sébastien Loeb won every Drivers' Championship from 2004 until 2012. Absolute domination. So, although the BX 4TC was a complete failure in every conceivable way, it didn't stop Citroën from coming back and having a second shot at it 16 years later and achieving absolute perfection.